Hi, everyone, and welcome to this next episode of the Sustainable Connections podcast. I'm Mark Lee, the Global Director of Thought Leadership at ERM and the regular host. In just a moment, I'll introduce the panelists that I have assembled today to tackle 2025 trends in the sustainability space. But to remind listeners who might be new, the Sustainable Connections podcast is really about making connections between the different people, different entities, different organizations, what's happening in different regions with the greatest sustainability challenges. It takes that connections element seriously, and really fortunate today to have a panel of ERM speakers from across the US, Latin America, and Asia to explore with me our annual trends report. We're going to explain the trends report itself in a bit more detail when we get started. One thing I do want to let listeners know is that we are recording today in the middle of January, and it puts us just before the World Economic Forum in Davos. It puts us just before the inauguration of the new administration in the US. So with me today, I said 4 of my colleagues from inside ERM. 2 of them are actually part of the same thought leadership team that I am. First of those, like me, based in California, is Aiste Brackley, who's the director of the ERM Sustainability Institute. Aiste, appreciate you being here today.
Hello, great to be here.
Also a part of our thought leadership team, Andrew, or you're going to hear me call him Andy Engel, who is a research and networks manager in the thought leadership team. Andy's based on the East Coast in the US, so in Washington, D.C. Andy?
Thanks, Mark. Always excited to talk trends.
Terrific. Me too. Reaching farther afield, at least from where I am, stretching all the way across the Pacific, Rebecca Green is ERM's technology sector lead in Asia Pacific. And if I have it right, you're based in Yokohama, I think, Rebecca, in Japan?
Yes, I'm based in Tokyo, and thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here today.
Well, appreciate you doing this your morning, my afternoon. And Ricardo Zibas is the last member of our crew today. Ricardo is based in Sao Paulo in Brazil, so drew the short straw in terms of this being his evening so we can record across time zones. Ricardo is the head of ERM's climate change and corporate sustainability practice in Latin America. Ricardo, welcome.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for the invitation.
Terrific. So thanks all of you for joining. We're going to range across some of our trends in the course of this and tell people where they can get access to the full report. Andy, I want to start with you. And Andy, within a wider team that works on trends all year long so that we can produce both our quarterly and annual reports, you lead the trends research. What strikes you about how this year's findings are different than other recent years?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. A major theme that jumped out to me is the ability of macro issues like the global election wave that swept the world in 2024 and the really emergence of artificial intelligence to influence almost all aspects of the 10 sustainability trends we cover in the report. While we've seen this before in terms of big issues impacting many different sustainability trends, the scale of this year's impact was different. Just for 2024's global elections, you can see the impact everywhere and when it comes to sustainability, from how the world is approaching climate action and then how the future of sustainability disclosure initiatives are shaping up in the face of more right-wing swinging elections in 2024, to how companies are ensuring supply chain resilience and speaking out on political issues. And then, of course, artificial intelligence seems to be everywhere and is affecting everything from how companies are pursuing corporate climate goals and also how companies are approaching geopolitical relationships, sustainability disclosure, and worker training. There's truly not an issue where artificial intelligence has not impacted companies over the past year.
I'm struck that it's both fun and fascinating. It's complicated. We're going to try and unpick some of it. So we won't have time to touch on all the trends in the report today. For folks listening, you'll be able to pick this up on our website. We'll have a link in the podcast description to make that easy for you as well. Aiste, I want to come to you. You've also been part of this process for multiple years now. You're based in the US, and we're going to take something of a regional look with you, Ricardo, and Rebecca at some of these issues. You also watch developments really closely in other regions, especially the EU, and I'm kind of going to assign you that part in addition to North America. Can you give us a sense of how you think a couple of the trends are going to play out in those regions in 2025? Maybe 1 or 2 key developments that companies should expect.
For sure. And I was reflecting today just before the podcast how much things have changed in just 1 year. We had a similar conversation around the same time last year. We were staring down a year where more than 70 countries were heading to the polls, more than half of the world's population, right? A lot of uncertainty. And nowhere will this be watched more closely than here in the US, where the pendulum is swinging, right? With the election of Donald Trump as US president and also a Republican-led Congress. And it's really hard to predict what will happen. I think what we can say with certainty, though, is that we will continue to see a clash, polarization between staunch proponents of ESG and sustainability and those who oppose it. And we will watch it play out. We will likely to see the rollback of some of the ESG-related legislation and rules, the Stock Exchange and Commission climate rule that was proposed by the Biden administration. We're likely to see some setback to environmental regulations as well as the climate rule, for instance, methane emissions regulations and others. In the EU, while we don't have a lot of major elections, we have Germany, I guess, that will be deciding who will be in power for the next few years. But a major development on the EU side will be that we will see the first sustainability reports of EU headquartered companies that are aligned with the corporate sustainability and reporting directive. That's a major milestone. And this space is being watched by companies all over the world as they look to align with these regulations and comply globally. And in many ways, that will set the tone for what's to come. So a lot of developments. I think while there will likely be some changes in legislation, I think one thing for sure, the train will keep moving. We have the energy transition in motion. It's what economics, dynamics and laws and rules currently support. It actually makes sense for businesses. And this is the train that will not stop. We will see increasing investments in renewable energy in the US in particular with the Reduction Inflation Act, the continuing investment in clean energy. And similarly in Europe, that space will continue to grow.
Great. Thanks, Aiste, for kind of setting up the table across a couple of continents. I want to just keep that rolling. And Rebecca, turn to you and then Ricardo. Kind of ask the same question that I asked Aiste, but through the lens of the regions where you live and work. How do you see a couple of the 2025 trends playing out in APAC? Rebecca, we'll start with you, and across Latin America. Ricardo.
I'm going to absolutely agree with Aiste in saying that the train will keep moving, including in Asia Pacific. Some of the political uncertainty, while there is some, and I'll touch on that, does not exist here like in other geographies. So there will continue to be advancements in climate change regulations, in advancing renewable energy, in discussions around other carbon-free energy solutions within the region. That said, I also will pull the word unpredictable from Aiste in that, there's situations like what's happening in Korea where we need to stabilize a government before we start talking about what's going to happen with climate and environmental regulations. So, the Asia Pacific, working here every day, it reminds me how diverse that the region is, from Australia to India to include countries like Japan, Korea, Singapore. So there's a lot going on, but we're not also facing a lot of, in general, that backlash towards ESG yet. It still seems that green will continue to be something that companies are willing to invest in, companies that governments want to solve. Japan, for example, is advancing its revised energy policy on green transformation. So I think we will continue also to see that train continue to move forward, and keep an eye on the instability within the political situation and the fallout from whatever happens with geopolitical tensions with other regions.
Makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad for the reminders, Rebecca, as Andy and Aiste were talking and both mentioned kind of shifts in governing power to the right. I'm struck that was true everywhere except where it was to the left, like in the UK. And that really maybe part of the message, at least, was that incumbent governments fell almost everywhere, right? No one got reelected, and that's been the pattern post-pandemic. I still think that's a factor. and then you're coming in with a perspective from another region and saying, actually, things are quite stable here. It's a different governmental circumstance, and we need to look, I think, through each of those lenses into each region to try and figure out what's really going on. Ricardo, how about where you're sitting?
Thanks, Mark. I will use the same metaphor, so the train has left the station, but I'd like to highlight two of the trends. The first one would be responding to climate change. And why is that? Last year, we saw a dramatic increase in natural disasters in the region, such as the water scarcity in Mexico, the early hurricane season in the Caribbean, and the floods in the southern part of Brazil, just to mention a few of them. Well, so although many companies in the region are already measuring their climate risk, those events were able to scale up the importance of climate change mitigation and adaptation to a whole new universe of companies, not only the large multinationals, but also local and regional organizations. So I think 2025 will be the year that climate change will finally become a material topic for the C-suite in Latin America. The other trend, I would say, it will be a mix between safeguarding natural systems and building sustainable supply chains. Because as a hotspot for biodiversity and natural resources, the question of how to safeguard natural systems is becoming a key issue for Latin American organizations, which got even more momentum after the Biodiversity COP held in Colombia last year. So business is starting to realize the importance of measuring and reporting their impact on nature. Deforestation is getting more and more attention as markets demand more information from their suppliers, and many of them are located in Latin America. Finally, it's also linked to climate change because a huge part of greenhouse emissions come from land use change and illegal deforestation, especially in Brazil, where they account for the larger part of emissions.
All good reminders as well, Ricardo. And I think the pace we've seen in the evolution of the nature and biodiversity related agenda, not just based on the COP16 Cali, Colombia, but since COP15 in Montreal, has been remarkable. And it's great to hear that that's having an impact kind of in a region where you sit, and you think it's elevating more to the C-suite. Andy, I'm going to dig in a little bit more with you, and we've already had several comments on climate, but I think it warrants us staying there. You and Aiste touched a bit that there are going to be shifts in transparency and stakeholder scrutiny or demand around climate. That applies to both countries who are supposed to bring their updated nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, to COP30, the next climate COP, which will see us in Brazil. And a whole bunch of companies, as Aiste said, are facing the first requirement to release their CSRD and ISSB aligned disclosures. What do you think this is going to mean for companies and countries stepping up to the challenge of meeting or maintaining progress towards the Paris Agreement, especially given some of the ESG backlash and other factors we see in play?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll break things down into both countries and companies. So starting with countries, you mentioned COP30 in Brazil. We are seeing many prepare for COP30 by publishing their third generation of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which are countries' overarching climate targets under the Paris Agreement. This includes a host country, Brazil, which raised its goal to reduce emissions by 67% by 2035 from 2005 levels, and the United Kingdom, which committed to an 81% reduction by 2035 from 1990 levels. We also expect a flurry of other updated NDCs for 2035 in the run-up to the February 2025 deadline. At COP30 itself, expect discussions around climate finance to continue following the agreement in Baku at COP29 to triple climate finance to developing countries to $300 billion annually by 2035. So that's what's happening in the country space. And there's still a lot more to cover there, but in the time allowed, I'll just keep it at that. For companies, many of which have already set emissions reduction goals, their attention is shifting to the hard work of implementation. Here, we expect that climate transition planning is rising up agendas as these companies look to define strategies for how they will shift their companies towards the low carbon economy and integrate associated actions into their wider business strategies. While many companies are now publishing climate transition plans, fewer have yet to fully align them with 1.5 degrees Celsius. So expect more numbers there to rise in the coming year. And then also expect the number of initiatives such as the Transition Plan Task Force emerge to help companies develop stronger and more comprehensive climate transition plans to help propel action forward.
Thanks, Andy. And, a couple things strike me there that We have some countries putting bold new plans on the table, but we're still waiting for news from many. And for as excited as I am about some of the climate transition plans coming down the pipe, it's still relatively few companies doing it. I was in another conversation recently on another podcast, actually, where one of the panelists said, "Yeah, the glass is half full, but the glass just isn't big enough. We need more in there to get all this done." Ricardo, Andy touched on Brazil being host of COP30 next year. The expectations for it, I think, are outsized. Brazil, of course, hosted the Rio Summit in 1992, Rio plus 20. It's the heart and lungs of the world in so many ways in biodiversity terms, given the Amazon. Yet COP30 can't make magic differently than other COPs, I don't think. What are your expectations for the event, and how might it be different, if indeed it will be?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, of course, Mark. Every time I return from a COP, and I have been part of the Brazilian delegation since COP12 in 2006, my usual answer is that we have to keep in mind that COP is always a process. So some of them have more announcements than others, but the negotiation building blocks and the roadmap have to be agreed many COPs before. So from that angle, COP30 is expected to be one of those announcement COPs, right? One positive note is the so-called Troika, which is from Dubai to Belém, which it's a group which aims to keep the negotiations momentum going, despite the changes of COP presidency, assuring a more structured workflow. So that's the reason why we're expecting a announcement COP. So that said, there are expectations on the implementation of the global stocktake recommendations, also to align the NDCs with the goals of the Paris Agreement, efforts to expand climate financing, especially in light of the divided opinions, and also further developments on the Article 6 and the carbon markets.
Yeah, and the carbon markets piece, I think the Troika news is really interesting. I think the fact that Article 6 is now kind of complete, we're in the position for the first time post-Paris where all of the major articles of Paris have a plan. They are agreed. So maybe we get announcements that stem from the fact that we're at that stage of Paris implementation. Rebecca, in a moment where there's backlash, it's hard. We saw companies last year restating or revising their overall sustainability strategies and sometimes specifically their climate strategies. But we did a survey across the course of the year in which we found, and this is an ERM piece of research, in which we found that APAC company executive leaders were significantly more positive about their organization's climate performance than business leaders in other regions. And I wonder if you can put a finger on why that might be so. Again, there are governmental differences going on in the region. What's happening in terms of climate?
Yeah, Mark, this one actually, I had to read that survey and read that survey and read that again because I was trying to imagine why, in sitting in Asia Pacific, as if I were a executive in a company, my outlook on climate would be more positive than my peers in North America or the EU. And I would think, reflecting on this, I mean, Asia-based corporations have a tendency to lag a little bit compared to EU and NA and their climate regulations. But that said, if I'm in that position, I'm generally sitting in a country with a relatively well-defined NDC. So that's a good starting place. So we've got a plan as a country. We know where we're going. And then on top of that, the plans I've set might not be until 2040 or likely 2050 for net neutrality. And so I think there's been a tremendous amount of progress made in getting policies in place, in establishing these goals and setting up the corporate governance structure to enact on these goals. And it's a good it's a feel-good spot right now. But it might be a temporary honeymoon period to some extent, not taking away anything from all of that progress that's been made. But as we look to do the hard work in implementing the decarb plans, that's where I think maybe a little bit of that positivity may be met with frustration that we've seen from other geographies. So I think just in terms of addressing that this year, the coming years are a good time to get ahead of that, stay competitive, and then where APAC-based headquarters companies where they might be facing, value chain pressures, either from EU regs or from other companies who've set more aggressive targets. It's a good time to get a handle on that. So I think we're going to see more focus on that area this year. So that is about all I could come up with in terms of the positive outlook.
I love the analysis. I think these conversations are interesting because they periodically throw up a new potential metric, and I think we're all going to have to keep an eye on whether it's causation or correlation. Do we see a pattern where companies with better, or countries with stronger NDCs show demonstrably better performance on climate for companies that are headquartered in those regions? And I think there'd be some logic to that, right? It would indicate a supportive policy environment and everything else. I could stick with climate all day. I do want to cover a couple of the topics with all of you, get into some issues around supply chains and technology, including AI. Aiste, I'm going to go to you on supply chains. And there's, of course, real close connection to climate and to geopolitics and to disclosure rules and regulations. What do you expect in the supply chain space, and what should therefore companies expect in terms of supply chain and value chain evolution in 2025?
Absolutely. And I feel like every time we talk about supply chain, we have to talk about disruptions, right? I don't think there's been a year where we can say, oh, great year ahead for supply chain. So I think it's going to be one of those years where, again, there's quite a lot of unpredictability, and definitely a direct connection to the climate challenges that we're facing, to the geopolitical landscape that is very uncertain. And just 4 quick points here on supply chains. I think on climate specifically, I was just reading a report today from a supply chain intelligence firm that essentially predicts that water will be causing the major disruption for supply chain and will be the greatest risk for the coming year. And this is closely related to the extreme weather events that we're having and all the other unpredictable climate emergencies that companies that are facing. So expect more of that. And the second area, also related to climate, but perhaps more how we are tackling it on the expectations that are related to decarbonization, and especially decarbonization in the supply chain. So companies are already grappling with how to reduce emissions to the supply chain, but what we're seeing is a growing number of regulations that are actually being put in place, so such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU, and the UK is introducing similar rules and others. And combined with the disclosure expectations, companies will really need to zero in on their supply chains, understand where everything's coming from, and where are the real levers to decarbonize those supply chains. The third area is tariffs, free trade. Again, with the political environment, while free trade continues to grow, I think we're also seeing a growing number of restrictions. And likely from the US administration, Mexico, Canada, China, we're likely to see more tariffs, more trade wars, and uncertainty for companies, to which many are likely to respond with more onshoring, which may be good or bad, depending on the situation and how companies tackle that. And the last issue I will mention is minerals, critical minerals, and tensions over their supply and what is needed for clean energy transition. I think we'll see more and more happening in that space.
Got it. I think all 4, again, I think you used the word uncertainty a couple times in the course of them, but they all throw up significant dynamism in the market, if we want to call it that, and they'll all be challenges for folks to navigate. Rebecca, in a moment, I want to come back to you on supply chains, but given where Aiste ended with the mention of critical minerals, Ricardo, I'd wanted to ask you about critical mineral supply chains in Latin America, how it's affecting companies in your region. Clearly, there's a race for critical minerals to supply the low energy transition and technology. It's a bit the Wild West. How do you perceive what's happening? How is that shaping or reshaping supply chains from where you sit?
Yeah, of course. As you said, the demand for minerals for the global energy transition will continue to drive mining investment across Latin America in 2025. Usually, the number one challenging holding investment back is the complexity and length of the permitting process, right? Like you said, There is a thin line between the Wild West and a lot of red tape. So legal and political uncertainty is also a feature in Mexico, while in Argentina, the change of government a year ago has created favorable market expectations, but at a huge social cost and increased inequality. Nevertheless, the total pre-operational capital expenditure for the next years in Latin America is material. It's around $60 billion.
Huge number. And can you describe the sort of mood that surrounds this, Ricardo? It's are people and the societies that we're talking about excited about the investment and growth this represents, or worried about the potential impacts of the mining and other industries that are involved?
Well, I think, well, it's a perception of mixed feelings, Mark, because Latin America is not an homogeneous region, right?
Mhm.
So usually what we see with the communities that are very close to the facilities or to the assets, there is increasing questioning or challenges on companies and on resource use and what will be the benefits of having such operation next door. For communities that are living outside or are not close, they're quite excited because it poses a new cycle of mining investment. And it's not only mining, but all the infrastructure that you need and the logistics that you need to assemble a project of that size. So I was also aware of huge investments in ports that exports minerals. So it's a whole complexity chain of investments and events that at the end of the day will also help solve one of our biggest issues in Latin America, which is logistics and infrastructure.
It just sounds like something that we almost have to do, but that we have much work to do it better than we have historically in some cases. I keep being confronted by this statistic that we need to produce as much copper in the next decade and a half as we've produced in all of history if we're going to build power lines and put it in all the other pieces of technology that we want for the low energy transition. And that means big complex infrastructure and mining projects to support that. So we just have to do it well. Rebecca, a different angle on this. When I think about trade and geopolitics and supply chains between APAC and the rest of the world, well, one, there is still a great degree of truth about how much of supply comes from China in particular, but from a region in general for the whole world. And then in technology terms, there's obviously incredible tension around chips, around AI, around the sophistication and use of these technologies and who gets to control those. So can you see that shaking and reshaping supply chains from where you sit in Japan?
Absolutely. I think that is the certain part of supply chain, is that uncertainty will remain largely due to the geopolitical tensions associated with these supply chain issues you mentioned. And that means we're going to continue to see further diversification of supply chains. So that's something we've been observing at a much more rapid pace. And with that comes an entirely different set of sustainability challenges. So we've got supply chains relatively well set up in China, Japan, Korea, which have a handle on renewable energy plans, a handle on health and safety issues. But now we're seeing that diversification to countries like Thailand, Vietnam, India at a pretty rapid pace. That's creating some chaos. And so that's creating challenges with permitting, with, what are we going to do about renewable energy in these new countries? What are we going to do about circularity and waste recovery in these new countries that we're operating in? And so I think that part of it is going to be the next challenge that we're really going to look at. So the first step is stabilizing supply chains and diversifying. But we can't assume that what's worked and what's in place in the current supply chain is going to translate perfectly to the new countries of investment. And so I think this year there's going to be much more progress on that now that we're more certain that diversification is going to continue.
Yeah, and for the reasons that Ricardo and Aiste touched on early in the conversation about weather-related and other events, physical impacts of climate change, disrupting supply chains in that way. We need these things to be resilient. We need them to work, and yet we're moving where they operate, how they operate, and fighting over who gets to control them. It's quite a time. Andy, in your opening, you said in a way this has been the year of AI, maybe by extension the year of AI and technology, and certainly it's rapidly surged forward. And beyond AI, it's data centers and their growth, and the energy and other demand that goes with that. It's critical minerals, as we've touched a little bit already. It's social media and its influence on our politics. Technology is without question in the spotlight. Stepping half step at least away from that, another part of the story is the sustainability related opportunities for technology to help sustainability progress across all sectors. So what about that angle? What can technology do to drive this agenda forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's been, of course, a lot of focus on AI over the past year, both for its potential to transform the economy and also sustainability action. I mentioned this at the start, but for companies, when it comes to AI and their sustainability efforts, there's front office benefits from, say, streamlining sustainability disclosure processes that might have took a lot of human power and effort over the last few years, to things like operational efficiencies in terms of reducing emissions, increasing water use efficiency, and kind of environmental impact reduction methods through AI. And so, of course, lots of focus, and rightly so, on AI. However, it is not the only show in town when it comes to applying technology to sustainability. In our annual trends report, we touch on technologies like artificial and virtual reality, which are being integrated with artificial intelligence as well, that are helping companies better train workers on how to handle things like dangerous situations that they might not have been able to train on before without actually physically placing them in dangerous situations. Then there's also kind of the more emerging technologies, things like quantum computing and spatial computing, that will likely push the ball forward for companies, both in terms of business opportunities as well as sustainability performance improvements as well. You mentioned AI and technology's broader environmental impacts, Mark. Of course, companies also must account for these impacts outside of just performance improvements. AI itself has an incredibly high energy consumption, which in turn leads to high carbon footprints when that energy consumption is being met by fossil fuels and non-renewable energy resources. And so companies that are involved in AI must directly account for these impacts. So far, we've seen mostly technology companies that, of course, are directly involved in developing and implementing artificial intelligence that are making moves to mitigate the environmental impacts of AI. However, all companies are going to have to eventually confront AI's environmental impacts down the line as well. I mentioned companies in the tech space acting. Some of the most notable examples come from the United States, where major tech companies like Google and Amazon are exploring the use of small modular nuclear reactors to power data centers and reduce emissions, as well as Microsoft, who is working to revitalize the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania to power its AI activities while ensuring it meets its decarbonization goals as well. So again, I expect a lot of these developments, especially from the tech side, to continue as companies look to make sure that AI doesn't put their climate goals out of reach.
So much going on across the tech space, all of it high potential. And I guess maybe I'm struck that that's where we are, that we don't yet fully know what the impacts of these new and burgeoning technologies will be, how quickly we'll harness the energy demand, how much we can use AI to solve sustainability challenges instead of increase some impacts, at least in some areas. Rebecca, Ricardo, I'd just be curious if you have a perspective from each of your regions again on whether the perception and application of new technologies as a sustainability problem solver is similar or different. And Rebecca, maybe you first.
I guess if I can touch on this more from an industry perspective, from tech industry lead for the region, something Andrew said about the increased demands for energy and water to back these AI tech solutions is absolutely real. And I think there's going to be this year some really interesting solutions to address this. If we want AI to help be a part of the sustainable solutions, we need to build the data centers, and we need to use the energy, and we need to use the water. And so tech is already much more aware. They're becoming part of the energy solution as well. And so this area, whether it's generation of renewable energy, generation of carbon-free energy, smart grid solutions, tech companies need to help advance that through collaboration with local governments. And I think this space is going to be incredibly dynamic over the coming years. We're still seeing AI data centers being sited, not yet built, but we've got to solve for these. So we've got to figure this out. And I think it's going to be a really interesting space to watch. And I'm very excited to see how tech companies are going to help advance carbon-free energy solutions in the coming years.
I love the way you framed that. It piqued my interest, and I'll watch through that perspective as well as others going forward. Ricardo, what about you?
Mark, we see all kinds of movements here, but one thing that grabbed my attention is that for the first time last year, we had a community blocking a data center in the greater São Paulo area because of energy consumption. And that never happened before. Yeah, so communities are becoming aware of all the burning in energy of those assets may represent. But on the other hand, especially we see a lot of investment in not only new technologies, but also new processes such as biofuels of next generation, sustainable aviation fuels, and especially hydrogen are getting pace in the region. Of course, a bottleneck is the direct foreign investment, right? And it's also a very sensitive issue in Latin America because the mantra to attract direct foreign investment is always market liberalization and workforce flexibilization. But there is a perception that it also brings more inequality and more poverty. So we are trying to find the middle way, the middle path on how to deal with all of those issues.
Yeah, and we didn't really focus on it today, but in essence, you brought just transition into the conversation as well, that how we solve these problems has to deal not only with the technical and the environmental and other impacts, but it absolutely has to deal with the social and the economic and bring people through this so that the low carbon world we create is better for more folks on the other side. You also, Ricardo, gave me a bridge to the question I wanted to wrap up on. You mentioned the communities in Sao Paulo and their response to development in their region, which I think points to stakeholder agendas and how companies and governments need to continue to partner with and listen to society to get the sustainability agenda up, running, and successfully delivered. How do we improve global collaboration in a fragmented, uncertain, complex world, the one that we've been describing in today's podcast? So just thought as a way to go out today, I'd ask each of you what opportunities you see for collaboration in the sustainability space that will make a difference. Ricardo, I'm going to start back with you and then work my way through the panel.
All right. Yeah. We see that, there are a lot of different views on that angle. There are also this terminology, which they call a world with the G0 governance, which nobody is leading, right? So I think that the key is that we have to understand that the challenges are common, not only to companies, but to sectors at the end of the day, to societies, right? So there's a huge space for sector collaboration in different geographies, as well as technology transfer. We also can unlock competitive advantage and also a more rational resource use. So as we live in a more connected world, so let's use it as an advantage to fill the gaps and build the bridges instead of increase polarization.
Aiste, you're next.
Yes, talking about polarization, I'm in a country that's deeply polarized and fragmented. And I think collaboration will change over the next few years. I think it will be different. And we saw just, recently we saw, for instance, a number of banks leaving the Net Zero alliances and other companies following in similar footsteps. I think that opens space for more individual action. I think there's a silver lining there. Not all collaborations have delivered in the past, right? There was so much focus on messaging and the symbolic language, right, that comes with that. I think the focus will shift more inwards and open the door also for more internal collaboration within companies between finance, sustainability, HR, legal, IT, all the other teams. So I think it will evolve. Collaboration will stay for sure. And we could do another podcast on collaboration too. That's an interesting tool.
Yeah, I think people sometimes underestimate the degree to which collaboration is literally a learned skill, right? And we need to continue to get better at the act of collaborating as well as the promises that go with it. Andy, I'm going to come to you next, and then Rebecca, it's going to be yours to close. Andy.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And so we've talked a lot about elections on this podcast so far in 2024's global wave of elections. Of course, this is going to mean the sustainability policy landscape is likely to be a lot different. I'm thinking more fragmented and less ambitious. And so one way I see collaboration moving forward is through a trend we talk about in the report itself, and that is responsible policy engagement, where companies work with policymakers to develop laws and regulations that really align with the company's own sustainability objectives. This might seem hard in the wake of some elections, particularly places like here in the United States, where a party that's more anti-climate action is in power. But as we saw today, just on Capitol Hill here in Washington, D.C., where the Trump administration's energy secretary nominee talked a lot about fossil fuels, but he also talked a lot about innovative new energy technologies, things like carbon capture and hydrogen that will likely be essential to decarbonization going forward. So companies that have room to engage on some of these more innovative topics when it comes to energy and decarbonization. And so would encourage companies to focus on types of engagement, right? The policy level that is going to actually push action forward, and that might find receptive voices in the chambers of power throughout their countries that they operate in.
Right. To run for surprises there in who's going to be leading on these things, it sounds like as well. Rebecca.
Yes, beyond collaboration, what I would like to see and hope to see is that we have more conversion and alignment of what we're asking companies to do, others to do in terms of practical implementation, so that we can come up with solutions. We're essentially all wanting the same thing. We have the same goals, largely the same objectives, but how we're asking for it. So not just collaborating on solving an issue, but aligning and converging on those asks so that we can really drive progress.
Thank you. No, thanks all four of you for your time today, your insights all the way through the conversation, and for these final notes on collaboration. And I heard notes of optimism in each of them. So that's part of what I'm going to take away on the day. To listeners, if you've made it this far, if you're interested in Sustainable Connections, all the past episodes are on erm.com. If you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear it at any time, be that commentary on the episodes we've recorded or maybe suggestions for future conversations. Again, once more, just thanks so much to all four panelists today, and best wishes to all of our listeners. Bye for now.